My name is Sarah Jenks. I'm the Director of Education at Ford's Theater Society, and although this is Ford's Theater Society North for the next we don't know how long, we're really pleased to be hosting a discussion today about a topic that seems particularly relevant in these last few weeks. What would Lincoln do about matters today? This question is at the heart of Ford's Theater mission, which explores Abraham Lincoln's legacy as much as it commemorates the events of his assassination. And today's panel was conceived and convened by Matthew Pinsker, a member of our advisory council, a professor of history at Dickinson College, and a fellow at the New America Foundation. These two institutions are our co-hosts this afternoon, along with Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which hosts Dr. Pinsker's online course, Understanding Lincoln. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Pinsker, who will introduce today's panelists.
So thank you, Sarah. Our panel today is what would Lincoln do, how Lincoln gets used and abused in today's Washington. And we're going to try to debate the nature of the invocations of Lincoln and when and whether they're legitimate. And to do that, we put together a group that is extremely expert in both history and policy. So I'll introduce them briefly. Then I want to describe a little bit more about how the panel came together, and then we'll get right to it. So first, to my immediate right is James Swanson. He's the Edgar Award-winning author of Manhunt, a best-selling book, probably the most influential study of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and he's been a senior scholar at the Heritage Foundation. Next is Craig Symonds. Craig is a professor of history emeritus from the U.S. Naval Academy, author of a Lincoln Prize-winning book called Lincoln and His Admirals, and also a particular mentor and a friend to me over the years in the Academy, so I appreciate that. To his right is Richard Norton Smith, who might be the Dean of the Presidential Historians. He was the founding director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. He's headed several presidential libraries. He's authored numerous political biographies, and he's here today to represent a kind of overarching perspective on the use of presidential history. And finally, Michael Lind. He's one of the co-founders of the New America Foundation. He's the author of a book called What Lincoln Believed, and he is going to give us that special mix of history and policy expertise that we're looking for. So what we wanted to do in this panel was try to culminate a semester of this online course that the Gilder Lehrman Institute and the House Divided Project has launched. It's an open online course. And so several of the questions from this course, called Understanding Lincoln, are actually have been generated by participants who are mostly K through 12 educators. And I'm going to read some of those questions to the panelists as we go through the session. And then also I'm going to take questions from the audience. I'll begin with a couple of questions from our K through 12 educators, and then I'll give everybody in the audience a warning and a chance to ask their own questions. Before I ask the first question, though, let me say a few words of thanks. So first of all, Lance Warren is the producer of the course from the Gilder Lehrman Institute. He's done a remarkable job in putting it together. At Ford's Theater, Sarah Jenks has been terrific in helping us with everything. At the New America Foundation, Becky Schaefer and Andres Martinez have been very helpful. And finally, at Dickinson College, at the House Divided Project, we have a student intern named Will Nelligan, who's working really hard to try to promote this on social media. So thanks to all of them. Thanks to the people who are here and to the course participants who've sent in questions. And of course, thanks to the First Congregational United Church of Christ for giving us this space in the absence of the availability of Ford's Theater. All right, so with that said, the first question I'm going to read to the panelists comes from Andrew Vilwalk, who was a course participant in Understanding Lincoln this semester. He teaches at Old Mill High School in Millersville, Maryland. And he asked a question about the shutdown. I thought we should begin a conversation about this crisis that we're going through right now over shutdown and debt ceiling. And Andrew's question is this. He says, Bill Moyers recently referred to the government shutdown as sabotage of the democratic process. He called it secession by another means. So what Andrew wants to know is, and I'll put this to Richard Norton Smith first and then open it up to everybody. He wants to know how the panel feels about that comparison, or how he thinks Lincoln, how the panel thinks Lincoln might have felt about that comparison, shutdown to secession. This is not something that just Bill Moyers has offered, but has become a kind of currency now in the latest debate. So Richard, would you mind trying to tackle that one first?
I get the easy ones. couple things come to mind. First of all, the easy answer would be to say that as the head of the Republican Party, Lincoln would have been in a position to prevent a shutdown. I'm not sure today's Republican Party would be so willing to follow his advice. The parallel with secession seems to me a bit extreme. To me, it's a little bit more like nullification. Secession is an act, obviously, that abrogates the very existence of the national contract. Nullification is a theory which, if implemented, as Andrew Jackson would have been the first to tell you, would have profoundly altered the nature of the Union, but it would not have necessarily ended the Union. So, and by the way, it's revealing that Lincoln had a portrait of Jackson,
Right.
that good Democrat, on the walls of his office.
So are you suggesting Lincoln asked, what would Jackson do?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think the age of Jackson arguably lingered into the Civil War.
Well, I want everybody to weigh in on this, but first, Craig, would you mind responding to that? Do you agree with Richard that this is a little hyperbole to compare the shutdown to secession?
Well, I think there's a connective link between the two. I think what's happened in the middle of the 19th century and in our own time as well is in an attempt by individuals who believe that the country is frighteningly on the wrong track and tried to wrench it back to a position that they advocate, and using what amounts to a form of blackmail to make that happen. And Lincoln confronted that, of course. It didn't begin with secession. I actually, anticipating that this question might come up, checked online to find what Lincoln said about this at Cooper Union in New York in February of 1860, a speech that some have argued is the most important speech he ever gave because it helped establish his credentials with the Eastern power brokers when he was seeking the presidency. And what he said, and I actually wrote it down because I wanted to say it right, in referring to those Southerners who wanted to create this kind of confrontational situation, your purposes, this is Lincoln, your purpose, plainly stated, is that you will destroy the government unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please. You will rule or ruin. You will destroy the Union, and then you say the great crime of having destroyed it is on us. A highwayman holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, "Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be a murderer." So we see Lincoln taking a pretty firm line as presidential candidate in 1860 against the notion that the government can be compelled to go in a direction outside the channels of established democratic procedures by a fierce and determined minority. So I think there are some connections here.
James, do you see it that way? Do you see the connective tissue?
No, I think what Moyer said is the silliest thing I've ever heard. Of course it's not secession. States leaving the Union, a civil war that resulted in the death of 750,000 Americans, apparently that's the latest figure, up from 625,000. It's just politics. Maybe it's a particularly extreme form of politics at the moment. We've had many shutdowns before. We've had disagreements like this in the past. I think one problem with modern American politics is we don't learn the lessons from the Jackson era and the Lincoln era. And those lessons are politics are tough, they're rough, they're defamatory, and this idea that we need to have a new civility in politics and compromise for the sake of compromise, I think is really ahistorical. You should see the things that were said about Washington, about Jefferson, about all the presidents in the 19th century. Politicians today are so thin-skinned. They're like little school children. You really have to have less respect than we do for the 19th century guys, because they could take it. It was rough and tumble. That's how American politics is. That's how Lincoln was. Lincoln was not Mr. Compromise. Once Lincoln thought he was right, as in fighting the Civil War, he said, it started by war, let it be tried by war. Once Lincoln decided that Union was constitutional. Secession was unconstitutional. The results of free elections for the presidency must be respected. No minority can leave the Union. Lincoln was rigorous and ruthless. The myth of kindly Father Abraham is a myth. Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and I say this without disparagement, it's simply a fact, they were the greatest killers in American history. They sent 750,000 men to die. To vindicate their principles, they would have sent twice that many to die if they could have. So I think Lincoln might have chuckled that we're so hot and bothered about this current temporary crisis.
Well, Michael, that's a hard act to follow, but do you want to comment on that comparison? Do you want to comment on what James just said?
Well, strictly speaking, nothing but another civil war is equivalent to the original Civil War.
Right.
But I think as the discussion of nullification earlier suggests, this is one of a series of maneuvers by which white Southerners have tried to compensate for the fact that since the 1830s they have been a minority in the electorate. The Civil War secession was an extreme expression of that, but we also have the conservative coalition in the 1950s. We have extra-constitutional things like the Solid South within the Democratic Party. The main difference is that the party of Lincoln has now been captured by its base, which is in the former Confederacy, largely of people who were Democrats as voters up until the last couple of generations. If you look at the Tea Party, half of its members are from the South. It is disproportionately in the South. This is not something that just sprang up like a mushroom in a rain in 2010 as a response to the TARP. This is the latest incarnation of a particular brand of Southern conservatism, quite different from New England and Midwestern and West Coast conservatism, that has existed throughout our history.
Would you call it populist?
No, I think it's conservative. The populists in the South have traditionally been divided between those who opposed the local Southern elite and sided with a national majority like the West Virginians and the East Tennesseans during the Civil War, and those who sided with their own states against the federal government. I think this, if you look at the Tea Party's makeup, and the Tea Party is driving this crisis for its own quite rational strategic purposes, in my opinion. They're more likely to be college educated than the average American, and they're wealthier on average. So this is, in my view, it's largely a Southern and Western elite, which is using, as political forces do, the instruments within its power to, if not get their way, to prevent losing as long as possible.
All right, well then let me turn the attention to the president for a minute. So in his response to this challenge, however grave it may or may not be, right? Sean Wilentz, who's a leading historian of the United States based out of Princeton University, he's been arguing in a series of op-eds that the president has been underreacting to this crisis, that he should be invoking constitutional authority in the way that Jackson or Lincoln did. He actually compares Obama to James Buchanan. And says his response in this crisis is more reminiscent of Buchanan during secession than it was of Lincoln. And I say this with love because Buchanan was a graduate of Dickinson College, where I now teach, class of 1809. But nonetheless, it was not intended as a love statement by Sean Wilentz. It's a harsh criticism of the president. So I wanted to see how you responded to Wilentz's argument. Does anybody want to volunteer to take that? Go ahead, Craig.
Well, I think one of the characteristics that made Lincoln a great political leader and a great president is the ability to be patient. It's rare, particularly now when reaction time is down to the milliseconds, when people are tweeting back and forth what someone said even before he finishes the sentence. But one of the things that gave Lincoln leverage in his dealings with his political foes and with his political allies as well is that he could wait and kind of see how things were tilting and how they were moving before he leapt. That's not really a bad thing to be patient. It's hard to do. We are not a patient society by instinct. And it was easier to do perhaps in the 1860s than it is in the 21st century. But that's not to say that patience was what characterized Buchanan. Buchanan was inaction. Buchanan just wanted to get out of office before the building collapsed around him. That's a slightly different thing from waiting to see how things work out. So I dispute the connection that Wilentz is making, and I think there's a certain strength to patience in leadership.
Also, you know, I've said many times that if Lincoln is the president against whom all others are measured, as I think he is, no small element of that is his political genius. There's never been anyone more skilled. FDR might give him a run for his money on a good day, but and the remarkable thing is that he didn't have public opinion polls. He didn't have all the devices that we take for granted, that we are inundated with. And he had instinct. He had his, what he called his public opinion baths, where literally the general public would come in. Most of them wanted something, usually a job, and the people around him said he was wasting his time and indeed endangering his health. Well, of course, Lincoln had been a disappointing job seeker himself. After his one term in Congress, he had done what lots of one-term Congress people do. He looked for government sinecure. In this case, the commissioner of the General Land Office didn't get it. He had, that's the other thing, you know, this whole question of what would Lincoln do, it seems to me is almost impossible to answer. But you can begin by saying, what did Lincoln do? What does it tell us about his character, his skill set, his capacity for growth, to learn from mistakes? In other words, what about Lincoln makes him so influential to modern presidents? Why is he the patron saint of embattled presidents, crisis presidencies?
Okay, but let me just press on this 1 second, right? So Sean Wilentz is arguing that Buchanan said that secession was unconstitutional, but he didn't have the power to coerce the Southerners back into the Union. That's how he makes the comparison.
But he's also
President
suggesting
Obama.
that you take, is it the 14th Amendment that he wants to use to basically nullify the debt ceiling? Well, that's an intriguing and very innovative interpretation of the Constitution.
But not Lincolnian?
This is again why 150 years makes a difference. In today's world, where the economy is global, where reactions are instantaneous, the uncertainty attached to that innovation, I think explains why the president has shied away from it. And to me, that's not Buchanan. I think that's exercising judgment.
Okay. Michael and then James.
President Lincoln was a lawyer and a student of constitutional law. He had a very broad construction of the powers of the presidency, which permitted him, in his view, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, but did not permit him to unilaterally abolish slavery. That had to wait for a constitutional amendment. President Obama is a lawyer and a student of constitutional law. He and his team, rightly in my opinion, have decided that the repayment of debts clause in the 14th Amendment, as generalized to U.S. debts in general in 1935 by a Supreme Court case called Perry v. United States, does not give the president authority to prevent Congress from defaulting on national debt. You could make a constitutional argument possibly that the debt ceiling as a statute impinges on the constitutional authority of the Congress, but it's very difficult to infer a power of the executive branch to do this. The Constitution does not prevent the government from doing stupid things, and default would be a truly catastrophically idiotic thing, but it would be a constitutional act of idiocy.
James, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, Richard, I like your point. One thing about Lincoln, though, that we can distinguish him from present day, Lincoln believed above all in mental clarity, verbal clarity, speaking exactly what he meant. Our best presidential writer ever. Lincoln wrote 98% of all the letters and documents issued under his name. Today, our leaders write almost none of them. And the fundamental link between mind and hand and deed has been broken forever. It's been corrupted. What's the core of this? Lincoln believed in simplicity. He said somehow, despite all the other reasons, somehow we knew that this special interest of slavery was the core cause of the war. Lincoln might say today, somehow the current crisis can be traced to this dispute over the Affordable Care Act. And Lincoln might say, well, what can one say about a law? Where one of the sponsors says, well, we don't know what it means. We'll have to pass it, and then we'll know what's in it. What would Lincoln say about a law that an administration defined as vital? And then that administration carved out dozens of exceptions to the law, and then said, let's delay part of it for a year. And then would Lincoln say, in traditionally American terms, vastly important social legislation is passed by consensus. The civil rights laws, without the Republicans, they wouldn't have passed them. Lyndon Johnson was a master of bringing all sides to that table. Lincoln was a master of doing that sort of thing. So Lincoln might say, I question the wisdom of attempting to pass a broad piece of nationwide legislation on a totally partisan basis with support of only half the country. So Lincoln might point these things out because of his respect for clarity and precision. He might say this lack of clarity, this lack of precision is the very cause of the trouble that's happening now.
And yet he based his entire presidency and the war that followed on 40% of the popular vote, which he certainly interpreted as a mandate to...
Well, that was to preserve the very Union itself against armed rebellion.
Okay, well, since James just brought Lincoln out against the Affordable Care Act.
No, I didn't. I said Lincoln would question the wisdom of trying to pass nationwide social legislation with such a narrow majority support.
Okay, I'll stand corrected. But it raises the important point, which is, can you ever invoke a historical figure in a justified way, or is it just self-serving? Are we all just sort of invoking these historical analogies to support whatever we believe? So with these panel of people, I thought it's an important overall question to ask. Is there a right way to do this or a wrong way to do this? Everybody seems to do it. So do you have any advice, guidelines, or warnings for people who try to do this? Richard, you addressed this earlier. Did you want to expand on that a little bit? Is there anything you can add to the would-be policymaker or pundit who wants to draw analogies to the past?
I just think there is a bright line between punditry and history or historical analysis. The historian is not only free to use his imagination, but it seems to me if he cares about literary quality, he's bound to employ his imagination to allow his reader to revisit an era that is otherwise impossible of access. That said, he's also bound by fact. And to project, imagine 150 years from now, people were to ask the question, what would Barack Obama do? What would John Boehner do? What would his Senate counterparts do? When they manifestly don't know from day to day what they're going to do. It's asking an awful lot, it seems to me, of posterity.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, James.
I think Lincoln would say, don't copy me, don't try to be like me, think like me. Lincoln did not say, I'm going to do whatever I thought George Washington would do. Or Lincoln loved Henry Clay. Lincoln wouldn't say, whatever Henry Clay would have done, I'm going to try to do. Bring in all the Henry Clay documents. He'll tell me what to do. Lincoln would say, identify my core principles. Liberty for all, absolutely equal rights for all under the law. Those were among his core principles. And so Lincoln would say, use my methods of close textual analysis, sober thought. Lincoln once said, I shall do nothing through malice. What I deal with is too vast for malice. More than any other American politician, he disenthralled himself from anger, personal pique. He could rise above it all. And so that was part of his greatness too. He doesn't do things maliciously for cruelty's sake. He's magnanimous, as he was at the end of the Civil War to the South. Be like him that way. Use his methods and adhere to his core principles. Certainly, by the way, one of his core principles, though he believed in internal improvements, railroads, rivers, Lincoln believed in sober spending. I think Lincoln would have been absolutely appalled at the Democrats today and the Republicans today at how much money this government spends. That would have sent him into a frenzy of disappointment, I think.
I think it's fair to say he never uttered the word trillions. Michael, can you take this question?
Lincoln, as a wartime president, presided over massive deficit spending. His wife, after his death, was asked what he planned to do if he had lived. And Mary Todd Lincoln said he planned to visit Europe, and then he wanted to take a trip to Alaska, where former Union soldiers would be digging up the gold to pay the national debt. I think to address the basic question, whether you can invoke a historical figure in contemporary controversies depends on how remote the figure is. You know, if it's Alfred the Great or Julius Caesar or something, it's kind of difficult. The controversies we're seeing now, the constitutional question of whether you have a broad or narrow expansion of interpretation of the Constitution, states' rights, nullification of federal laws, voter disfranchisement. We're living controversies now. They were living controversies even before the Civil War, and then during Reconstruction, and then during the 20th century. So while the Civil War, I think, is not a good analogy, the Civil War did not end the contest between a mostly Southern Jeffersonian force and Jacksonian force in American politics and a mostly Hamiltonian Northern tradition, which was formerly Republican, now it's mostly Democratic or independent. And simply to erase the fact that Lincoln was a Hamiltonian, guided in his political economy by the Hamiltonians like Clay, guided in his constitutional thinking by the nationalists like Kent and Story and Marshall, and to reduce him only to freedom, is to engage in what Henry Louis Gates has called the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King. You remove everything polarizing and controversial and partisan, and then you have a benign figure whom all sides can claim. 200 or 300 years from now, issues may have changed so radically that some of these issues are dead issues. The way temperance was an issue in Lincoln's time, it's not in ours. But I do think a lot of the contrasts that you're seeing over states' rights versus federal authority, this is a part of the controversy that existed in his day and continues in ours.
Can I add on to that, if it's all right? You're talking about the abuse of making reference to these historical figures as part of your legacy. It often amuses me that the Democratic Party every year celebrates Jefferson Jackson Day. Well, of course, Thomas Jefferson, iconic states' rights advocate, and Jackson, who certainly wanted to defend the Union during the nullification crisis, but frankly, almost not exclusively, but largely because he felt it a personal affront to his authority, and who nevertheless was the one in charge of the Great Trail of Tears and so forth. Not necessarily icons I think today's Democratic Party would hold up, and yet there they are. And the Republican Party holds the Lincoln Day dinner, which of course Lincoln and his views would not be compatible with much of what the modern Republican Party advocates. I have suggested in other venues that the Republican Party ought to have a Jefferson-Reagan dinner, and the Democratic Party should have a Lincoln-Franklin Roosevelt dinner, and that would make more sense than the current tendency. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. In his famous essay, Getting Right with Lincoln, David Donald pointed out that the communists in the 1930s had Lincoln-Lenin Day dinners. So apparently anything is possible.
The Klan.
Let me ask a follow-up question for one of the course participants, and then I think we can start to maybe set up the microphone for some audience questions. This is from Mary Beth Donnelly, who teaches at a middle school in Arlington, Virginia. It's actually called Swanson Middle School, but I don't think it's named after you.
It's my charter school.
It's your charter school. Mary Beth asks a good question, which is, in what area of politics is Lincoln's legacy most erroneously invoked or exploited, in your opinion? Is it race relations, civil rights, nationalism, religion, war powers, or something else? In your opinion, what is the most egregious abuse of his legacy that you've lived through or witnessed in the modern era?
Could I say the war powers?
Sure.
In that we don't understand how he used the war powers. Lincoln is used as a cudgel by some to attack our policies in the war in Iraq, Guantanamo, terrorism, etc. Lincoln the Pure would have never done these things. Well, How about 14,000 people arrested without proper warrant during the Civil War? How about a couple newspapers being shut down? How about a U.S. congressman being convicted and exiled to Canada? How about suspension of the writ of habeas corpus? Lincoln believed that in war, the laws aren't silent, but they speak with a different voice. Lincoln did these things. He once said, "Shall I obey all the laws and then see the Union destroyed? My ultimate oath is to preserve this Union." I think he would have done just about anything within reason to preserve that Union. He didn't do it to become a dictator. He held the elections of 1862, the presidential election of 1864. He didn't even dream of suspending those elections. He thought he would lose 1864. He'd rather lose than retain power by improper means. And so Lincoln authorized thousands of military tribunals during the Civil War. I'm convinced that his example is one that we should follow today when necessary, but it's wrong to think Lincoln was this wonderful, innocent, grandfatherly father Abraham, who was not absolutely ruthless and decisive when necessary to achieve his objectives. So Lincoln was a warrior. He was a warrior president who exercised his extraordinary powers. Okay, Michael?
Well, I would agree on the war powers question from a slightly different angle. From the point of view of the Union, the Civil War was the war of the rebellion. The states had never legally seceded. It was not a war between the states or of the federal government against the states. In their legal theory, this was essentially a giant riot. Now, realistically, they had to make some concessions to the fact that the South had an organized government. So they followed some international law standards governing belligerents who had not risen to the point of independence. But essentially, I think that all presidents, beginning with Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and going up to recent ones, who try to draw parallels between suppressing an armed insurrection on U.S. soil, which is largely a law enforcement police measure, even if you're using the armed forces to do it, just go wrong. It's fundamentally different from waging war against other nation states or empires or alliances. And it also tends to equate the two sides with pure good and pure evil in a way that I think leads to a misunderstanding of Lincoln's vision of the reunification of the U.S. under the rule of law.
Michael, you're right about that Lincoln recognized these were our countrymen. And Lincoln went easier than he would have done if we were fighting a foreign power. I think if it was a foreign power, Lincoln would have been much more ruthless than he was against the South and how he treated the Southerners at the end.
But Lincoln, as a Whig, was opposed to the Mexican War, and those in his tradition tended to be much more cautious about foreign interventions than the Southern party of his day.
Well, I'm not saying when Lincoln would intervene or not intervene, would Lincoln have gone into Afghanistan or Iraq? All I'm saying is Lincoln was particularly gentle the way he handled the South. And I think if Lincoln faced a serious foreign war...
I disagree with you because
he
commissioned Francis Lieber to draft a code of combat, which then became the basis of the Geneva Conventions. So let's remember when, for example, the Bush administration was saying various aspects of the Geneva Conventions don't apply to foreign nationals. The Geneva Conventions, part of their DNA goes back to the Lincoln administration trying to codify civilized treatment of prisoners of war during the Civil War itself.
There are several things about the Civil War that make it interesting to a latter-day audience, and one of them is that it sits on a technological pivot point where new weapons that had no previous assessment in terms of their legality, mines, for example, which are anonymous and just kill people randomly. And one of the reasons this Lieber Code was necessary was because not only was Lincoln struggling with what it meant to be commander-in-chief at a time of internal insurrection, but also how to deal with the new technology of war. So all of this is new, and he's dealing with it with a constitutional basis where the entire explanation for what the commander-in-chief can do from Article 2, Section 2, I believe, of the Constitution says, the President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy. Full stop. There's no explanation of what that means, how far those powers go. And Lincoln was willing to use those powers vigorously to fight a vigorous war and to use his judgment and assessment, even going so far as to say it's within my powers as Commander-in-Chief to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, lacking any other constitutional authority to do that other than I believe that falls within my power in a time of war. That's an elastic constitution that he's observing there.
Well, okay, this is an important debate, although it veers away from the question that Mary Beth had asked, which is about the most egregious abuse. But it does raise a different question that Rick Ochoa has asked. He's a participant from Sandy, Utah, who teaches at Alta High School, and he wants to know if Lincoln has set a bad example by his vigorous use of war powers. He says, the claim that Lincoln acted independently without congressional approval to secure the Union appears to have justified many independent actions since then. Understanding that Lincoln requested a retroactive approval from Congress, do we really want modern presidencies to utilize this president and simply act and then get permission or forgiveness later? This is in particular a reference to something we talked about in the course, which I called the chronology of powers, which I think Rick is objecting to here. Go ahead, Richard. And then, I'm sorry, before you begin, if you have a question, I think what we need you to do is line up behind the microphone, and then we'll start to turn to some audience questions. Go ahead, Richard.
It seems to me this is another way in which posterity warps what went before. It seems to me profoundly unfair to blame Lincoln for the use or abuse that later presidents have made, exploiting his unique status. There's no doubt that Lincoln redefined the war presidency. There are those out there, maybe here, who, for example, flock to the Madisonian standard as a constitutional president. No one went to jail for criticizing the president. It was a war fought, in effect, within constitutional restraints and with singular lack of imagination. And they burned this city to the ground. So if you want to follow the Madisonian approach, that's fine. Lincoln won. An extraordinary struggle, which was not in the end exclusively or even primarily military. It was a struggle to redefine the meaning of the United States. And above all, the meaning of the word freedom. One of the ironies is that freedom allows, indeed encourages, the very kind of debate, questioning, not only by scholars, but by pundits and others, who believe that had there been a War Powers Act in 1861, somehow the Constitution would have been in better hands.
Okay, let's turn to an audience question. If you could just tell us your name and then ask the question.
My name is Chris Nelson. I'm a lifetime student of the Civil War, collector, as my wife would lament. I do a daily newsletter trying to explain our country to Asian clients primarily, although the Canadians are a client for it. And about a month ago, I wrote a piece saying, you know, this fight that we've got goes back really to the founding of the Republic, but you really saw it during the Jackson presidency, and you saw it especially in 1860. And I didn't talk about secession. I talked about nullification and can you allow a minority to stop democracy from working? And I think that's in many ways, the key thing that we still haven't quite bridged yet. Because if you look at Lincoln's Cooper Union speech, or you look at the Gettysburg Address even, he's talking about what it takes to have a democracy survive. At what point does compromise kick in, or can a minority simply say, no, we're not going to play, you know, Lucy and the football? And that struck me then, and it strikes me now, that that's the real crisis that Obama and we're all facing, that we have a solid, small minority that seems to reinforce its beliefs by not actually listening to anybody else's, but, you know, that's how I see it.
But can you put it as a question to the
panel? And that's the question.
That's the question.
No, not the beliefs. But is it the question, the survival of democracy as we've been practicing it, if the current minority, the Tea Party minority, is able to simply stop government from working? Isn't that the strongest parallel between now and what Lincoln faced?
James, will you take this?
Yeah, can I give a brief Lincoln line to begin my answer?
Lincoln lines are encouraged completely.
It's one of my favorites.
But they have to be real quotes.
No, this is real. Lincoln told this story, and this is quoting Lincoln now. It's said that an Eastern monarch once charged his wise men to invent him a sentence to be ever in view, and which should be true and appropriate at all times and in all situations. And they presented him the words, and this too shall pass away. Democracy, come on, democracy is not being destroyed. The republic is not falling. We've had disputes like this for over 250 years on this continent. It's a legitimate dispute between the use of government power, the use of government funds, what is a majority, what is a minority. The country's not falling. We're not having secession. We're not having nullification. I think we're all too hot and bothered and excited about it. And just like Lincoln says, this too will pass away, and in 10 and 20 years, people will say, remember the 20th time there was that government shutdown? There was really strident then. Remember that? We're not having the crisis that some say we're having. I'm convinced of it.
Listen, I know some people might disagree or want to follow up, but let me put it that point James just made in a different light, and it's a different topic as well, but I think it's relevant to our panel, which is, how do you think Lincoln would react to the reports that people at Tea Party rallies have been waving Confederate flags, or that there are still Confederate battle flags that are appearing across the country, or that there are, I know this seems different, but how would he react to the idea that there are U.S. Army bases named after Confederate generals? Would he see all this as no big deal and part of the reconciliation, or would he be afraid that he had perhaps lost the war's legacy over the years?
Who?
Lincoln.
Who do you want to respond here?
Why don't you start?
I think he would have followed James' suggestion here. The story, of course, that many people remember is that when the war ended and the news came that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, which wasn't, of course, the exact end of the war, but near enough as matters, Lincoln made a point of, when the band said, what shall we play, he asked them to play Dixie. It's ours now by right of conquest, and I've always admired the song, and I think it was his effort to say all of this now is part of the legacy and heritage of that, and the Confederate battle flags may mean one thing to one group and another thing to another group, but I do not think that he would have gotten excited and wanted to change the name of Fort Hood or Fort A.P. Hill. Maybe Fort Hood. Hood was not a good general, but in general, I don't think he would have been excited about it, personal opinion.
I think you're right, Craig, because the symbols. My background as a First Amendment lawyer says we shouldn't be banning symbols. Now, interesting twist on the Confederate flag, though. The Confederate flag did become a different kind of symbol starting in the 1950s, when certain southern states began to adopt the Confederate flag into the state flag. That was not the case after the Civil War, and this was done in the 1950s as a resistance to desegregation and the Civil Rights Movement. So I think we'd have to admit that the Confederate flag was being used for improper purposes to resist the Civil Rights Movement. On the other hand, let's say the Confederate flag represented slavery and oppression for 4 years. Can I please ban another flag that represented slavery and oppression and violation of basic human rights for 150 years? Let's ban the American flag, because that was the flag of slavery. That was the flag of outrage. Remember, after the Civil War, when Jefferson Davis was imprisoned, and one of the Secret Six who supported John Brown put up bail money for Jefferson Davis to free him. And his fellow abolitionists, many of whom, of course, were racists all along, said, how dare you? How can you bail out Jefferson Davis from prison? He was the head of the slavery's empire. And he said, this is your mistake. You forget that slavery and racism was the great American crime. It's the great northern crime. It's the great southern crime. So I think Lincoln would have factored those views in, as Craig says, in thinking about this.
Okay, Richard? Lincoln could also afford to be generous. He'd won. Not insignificant a factor. But beyond that, Lincoln could also afford to relegate such symbols to history. He thought history moving forward was on his side. And remember, he had not, during the war, personalized the war. He had not demonized the enemy. He never forgot that someday peace would return, hopefully on terms agreeable to him. And over time, perhaps longer than his lifetime, there would be the, in some ways, infinitely harder task of reforging a sense of nationhood.
Okay. Listen, let's turn to the audience questions now, and we're heading into the sort of final phase of the panel, so let's just do our best to keep everything concise, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Go ahead, and tell us your name first.
Rhonda Sonnenberg, and I'm enjoying this very much. And I actually had not thought of this question until today, prompted by this discussion. Since the defining issue was keeping the Union together during that time, were there other states' rights issues, separate and apart from the Union, secession and Union and federalism at that time that Lincoln had to deal with? Because certainly states' rights versus federal is alive and well today. We have states refusing to enforce certain federal immigration laws, et cetera, and it's a really interesting topic to me. Were there other issues, states' rights issues that Lincoln had to deal with, completely separate and apart from slavery during that time?
Okay.
And what was his view?
Good question. Michael, do you want to address that and talk about some economic issues?
Well, of course, and Lincoln had a long career before he became president and presided over a civil war, and he was a fairly conventional member of the Whig Party, most of whose members migrated into the Republican Party with an infusion of some Jacksonian Democrats. The Whigs were the more nationalistic of the parties of their day, compared to the Jeffersonian Republicans who became the Democrats ultimately. They believed in a broad construction of the authority of the federal government, not an illimitable dictatorship or anything, but fairly flexible interpretation of federal powers. They believed in federal support for infrastructure, paid for by federal taxes, particularly in those days, tariffs on imported goods. They wanted an activist federal government supporting industrial capitalism in the United States. Their opponents, even when they favored infrastructure and business, wanted that done by state capitals rather than the federal government. And so you see a lot of these debates today. For example, the Obama administration supports a national infrastructure bank, which is opposed by many of the more states' rights conservatives, really for the same reasons that in the Jacksonian period, when Lincoln was a young politician, they wanted the states to handle their own infrastructure and opposed any kind of federal infrastructure. So there have always been tensions between the more nationalist and the more decentralist states' rights politicians.
Actually, in the South, unintentionally, did the nationalists a favor because by leaving Congress, for example, it became possible for the Republicans to pass a Homestead Act, a transcontinental railroad, the first income tax in American history, land grant colleges, all agencies of the nationalist, if you will, Hamiltonian impulse, all of which have been blocked by Southern votes.
Okay. Let's go to the next audience question.
Hi, my name's Andrew Small. I work at a Civil War antique store in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania called the Horse Soldier. And one of my favorite finds in my dad's shop was about basically an 1880s whistleblower revealing that a wet leader had been propagating a quote by Lincoln that was against prohibition. And of course, we know Lincoln spoke at the Temperance Society. He was an advocate of this. Can you think of a similar incident where our opinion of Lincoln has changed dramatically in that like a truth has become a lie or a lie has become a truth about his image?
These are good questions. Phony Lincoln quotes or
I've got a great phony Lincoln quote.
Go ahead.
At the Republican National Convention in 1992, former President Reagan said that the Democrats had failed to understand the principles of Abraham Lincoln, and he then quoted Lincoln. He said, "You do not strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You do not lift up the wage earner by pressing down the wage payer." And it went on and on and on. And as people quickly discovered, this was a fabricated quote made up by a Reverend Betker in a 1916 pro-business pamphlet. And it had made its way into a Toastmasters treasury of quotes from which Reagan had drawn it. So there's a real problem, as my colleagues I'm sure have discovered, and there's all kinds of apocryphal Lincoln quotes floating around out there.
You find a lot of them on the internet, by the way.
Which Lincoln did not invent.
What would Lincoln have done with the internet? That's what we need to know. The other thing is not wise, but it's surprising to people how quickly profound interpretations of Lincoln's historical significance changed, just within a few years after his death. If you look at the first Lincoln Memorial in the city, It's the Emancipation statue over in Lincoln Park, which says that Lincoln's primary historical significance is the man who ended slavery. By the time the other Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in the 1920s, that school of thought had been closed largely as North and South, however reluctantly, realigned. The regions came together, the races did not. And Lincoln's significance, Lincoln's meaning was transformed in the process.
In fact, in a hideous perversion, blacks were forced to sit in segregated areas at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial.
Next audience question.
Hi, my name's Steve Miller. I'm a park ranger at Ford's Theater. How do you think President Lincoln would try to prevent the debt can from being kicked down the road continually, equivalent to putting another card on the house of cards, which if collapses could lead to anarchy, martial law, and potential civil war in some sections of America?
We were talking earlier about what-if questions that all historians get, mostly from our students. My favorite was, do you think Pickett's charge would have been successful if the Confederates had had automatic weapons? It shows the difficulty of addressing hypothetical questions. The problem, of course, is 150 years ago, the economy of the planet, as well as the economy of the nation, was not so sophisticated. I mean, is more sophisticated now. And Lincoln was adjusting as needed. In addition to his patience, I think a key element of his leadership was pragmatism. What needs doing? What's the most efficient way to get that done? He didn't come to the office saying, we need an income tax in this country, but he saw the expense of the war, saw no other way in which that war could be financed, talked with Secretary Chase about what could be done, and they came up with the income tax. In the same way, I think he would have addressed the economic problems in a pragmatic way. This can't go on forever. We need a practical way. What's the best way? Well, reduce spending and raise taxes. Those seem to be the practical way. But that's as knowledgeable as saying, well, yes, if Pickett had had automatic weapons, he would have broken through. So I'm only speculating there, and I invite my panelists to speculate with me, if anybody would like to.
Well, I can speculate on the two things that I think Lincoln would say if he could view the modern world and come today. One that would outrage him and one that would sadden him. I think he would have been outraged to see how long liberty took to take effect in America after his death. A century till Lyndon Johnson, what a horrible legacy.
Yeah, well, he put Andrew Johnson on the ticket.
Well,
Did I say Andrew? I meant to say Lyndon Johnson.
Andrew Johnson necessitated.
And so Lincoln would have looked around the world, and I think he'd be very sad to see that slavery exists. He'd be disappointed to see how women are treated in so many parts of the world, either for religious reasons, cultural reasons. Hundreds of thousands of people are enslaved every year. Lincoln would think, I did it for this? The world hasn't been emancipated. And so I think he'd be very disappointed to see how people are treated in other parts of the world. And I still say, even though you give the good example of the Homestead Act, the railroad, some schools, Lincoln would have been stunned to see the size of the federal behemoth. He fought and won the Civil War and administered the civil government of the United States with 2 male secretaries on his staff. Today, the President of the United States has 3,000 personal employees. A congressman might have 1 assistant. Today, an army of 25,000 bureaucrats serves the 535 members of Congress and the Senate. The agencies, the millions of federal employees, no one in the 19th century, even if they were in favor of federal improvements and strong federal powers, could have imagined what it would mean today or what it would evolve into today.
Yes, but if Lincoln had looked around the world, he would have seen that all modern industrial democracies have government between 40 and 50% of their GDP at all levels. They have extensive welfare states. They have centralized regulation. And Lincoln, being someone who was generally in favor of progressive institutions and technology, would not have wanted to replace the modern Europe, North America, and Japan with a largely agrarian mid-19th century standard. So I think he would have adapted fairly quickly.
No, Lincoln wouldn't have wanted an agrarian world today. How about a private sector world today? I'm absolutely certain that all of the framers and that most of our 19th century leaders would have been disgusted and appalled at the size of the federal behemoth today? What it spends, what it does?
The main size of the federal behemoth is transfer payments for the elderly, Medicare and Social Security, apart from Pentagon. It's just simply transfers. The social insurance sector arose in every modern industrial society when farmers were replaced by urban wage earners who had no farm to fall back on. It happened in no matter what the governments were, Latin America, Europe, et cetera, in the middle of the 20th century. The founders had no problem with social insurance. One of the first federal social insurance programs were the merchant hospitals, the marine hospitals. The federal government taxed people who were not rooted on a farm, that is, rootless sailors, who are the equivalent of modern wage earners. The first Congress of the United States, the Congress of the Founders, they created the first federal safety net system. All sailors were obliged to pay a tax, which paid for free federal government health care of sailors in the United States, including foreign sailors. Now, granted, at that point, 9 out of 10 people were farmers and they didn't need it, but I think if the framers could have said, you know, in the 21st century, if 80% of people are wage earners in the service sector, their situation is closer to these federal sailors for whom we're creating a system of federal hospitals than it is to an agrarian America.
One sentence. I think you mistook that I was speaking of entitlements. I meant all the bureaucracies, all the agencies. I'll give you all that entitlement stuff.
But that's a negligible share of federal spending.
All right, well, listen, we're going to have to let the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians agree to disagree about Lincoln's legacy. Let's do one more audience question, and then I have one more closing question from the course participants.
Hi, my name is Deborah Balin with the Union of Concerned Scientists, Center for Science and Democracy, and my question kind of ties in with what you've just been talking about a little bit. So Lincoln, of course, presided over the founding of the National Academy of Sciences, and I was curious if you could comment on how he saw the role of science as informing policymaking and what we might learn from him today.
Craig, do you want to start?
Can you help me out? I'm sorry, I didn't get all of it.
The question is, how did Lincoln view the role of science in American society, or science and technology, perhaps?
Well, that's interesting. You know, Lincoln, before he became a full-time politician, tried to make a living kind of like Mark Twain. He contrived a series of speeches and went around the country giving them for fees, something people on the stage know a little bit about.
Some more than others.
One of those had to do with the science and technology, advances of science and technology in America in the early 19th century. And based on that, he seemed to be a strong advocate, a champion of science and technology. And to segue from that into this broader conversation that just preceded it, I think he was a strong supporter of the idea of federal support, national support for continuing scientific inquiry and investigation. Is that responsive to your question, I hope? Is that?
And Lincoln loved science.
He did. He was a gadget man from the beginning.
His lecture on discoveries and inventions,
Right.
the patent he tried to do. He loved testing new weapons and playing with them. He was a big supporter of the idea of advancement in science and the arts.
Right, right. The only president ever to hold a patent, by the way.
All right, so I've been told, you know, you have to close every good panel with a question from an elementary school teacher. So I have one here from Jamie Beck, who teaches at Three Rivers Union School, Three Rivers, California, and it's a broad one, but I think it's important. She wants to know, what should every second grader know about Abraham Lincoln? If you're going to reduce this down, not to policymakers, but to kids, what would you tell second graders about Lincoln? Go ahead, Richard.
That it is possible in this life, in this country, in this democratic system, with all its flaws, for anyone to overcome the limitations of their birth. And that social mobility, however defined, exists here more nearly than anywhere else.
Okay, now you don't have to feel you need to top it, but do other people here want to add to that?
Richard's exactly right. That's a great Lincoln example. And I think Lincoln would say this. Young lawyers would often write to him, how do I become a lawyer? What do I do? Should I move to that city? Should I move to the big city? Lincoln would say, work where you are now. He said repeatedly, get the books and read. Do your work hard. Lincoln would kind of scoffed at this idea of the digital divide, or you need your laptops, you need your iPads, you and all of it. Lincoln did it with a book of Kirkham's Grammar, the Bible, the life of George Washington, the Constitution, and the Declaration. Lincoln would say to young kids, work harder than you think you could dream of working. Don't rely on others to educate you. Go to school, of course. Do the work. Educate yourself. Read relentlessly. Strive. Achieve. Don't expect others to do it for you. Lincoln was a graduate of the first grade. And look what he made of himself through his readings and through his clear thought. He would say, work as hard as you can, kids, and don't expect to get it through the computers or through passive stuff. Work and read and think. That's what he would say.
Craig? Yeah, I want to tell just a short story, if I may. One of the prizes I won a couple of years ago for a book I did on Lincoln came from the New York Civil War Roundtable, and they presented me with a life mask of Lincoln, a Volk life mask, which, if you don't know, is actually created from wax placed on the subject's face and then a mold made. And I thought, this is so beautiful. I really want to share this. And I mentioned it to an elementary school teacher of my acquaintance, and I ended up going to 2 or 3 different elementary schools to show this off and to talk just a little bit about Lincoln. And I said some of the things that Richard and James have just mentioned, you know, the importance, you know, he saved democracy in a way, he unified the country, it struck at slavery, all the great accomplishments that he made. But I wanted to tell a little bit about his life as well, growing up poor. And I said one of the things that happened when he was quite young, and they say you can feel it on this life mask because it actually comes from his head, is that when he was 10 years old, he was kicked in the head by a mule. And if you feel right here on the side of the eye socket bone, you can feel where that was. But then went on to talk about Lincoln as a great president and so on. Well, of course, the teacher made everybody write Dr. Symonds a letter in the big block print thanking him for coming. Tell him what you learned. Every single one said, I learned that Abraham Lincoln was kicked in the head by a mule. So that's the legacy.
Michael, can you add anything else?
Well, when I was in the 2nd grade, I was taught that Lincoln, when he was operating a store, marched 5 or maybe it was 10 miles through the snow to return a nickel to someone, which at the time I thought was extraordinarily foolish, because surely the snow would melt and the customer would come back and probably an account there anyway. I've never been able to track this down. Maybe it happened. But so my advice to 2nd grade teachers is don't teach that story.
All right, well, I want to thank the panelists. They really are an all-star crew, and I want to thank everyone for coming. And I just want to say, if you're interested in this topic, or if what we're doing in the course is interesting to you, the participants in the course, the ones I've been reading questions from, they've created a new website called Lincoln's Writings, which is a multimedia edition of 150 of Lincoln's most teachable documents. And it's got a whole variety of multimedia tools that the teachers have built that's available free on the internet, and we're going to have clips from this panel there as well, and we're looking forward to doing that for classrooms across the country. And I bet that will kill this story about Lincoln walking 10 miles through the snow. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to our panelists.